Cool. In a perfect world, we live like purely in these verticals where you have the finder and methods like, hey, I have this description of an item. Like, just give me all the items that have this thing that the description matches. I have this ID number of a item. Like, hey, I just want this item ID number, right? This is what I live with. I have a cough drop because a little coughing, and then she's like, "That's a new smell. Like, I must investigate, make sure everything's okay." But yeah, you have a merchant. Like, hey, I have a merchant name. I should be able to grab the one merchant I need, or I have a merchant name. That's great. But as we know, life is not always that simple, and so looking at this data and looking at what we ask you to do, we are going to have to figure out how many things, like, we're going to have to figure out how these things interconnect, right? Like, if we have a merchant, we should be able to do things on their items. If you're looking at iteration 1, we start to see the starting of business intelligence. And excuse me, one of the first things is that average items per merchant. That's like a lot. But when we think about it, like, well, what we're going to know, like, to figure this out is like, should not a merchant know about all of its items? Shouldn't a merchant know like which items it sells? Like, I would hope so. Like, when we think about, I think that has anyone here never used Etsy? Or at least not known Etsy? Etsy is this marketplace where people can go in there, sign up for a thing, and sell their stuff online. So Etsy is a store that's made of lots of little stores. And so this is kind of like this similar kind of thing happening here, where we have merchants and they're selling all their own things, and each merchant sells its own separate things. And so if we're looking at how this data is laid out, we see that in the merchant CSV, I think it's called, we see that a merchant has an ID in there, right? And we also, when we look at the items.csv, we can see that items has a column that has merchant ID. Something very close to that? Am I correct? Some nods would help. Yes, fantastic. And so the thing is that there's a link between those two things. That merchant ID in the item, the merchant ID for an item is a direct link to the ID column in the merchant. So this is how we can form that kind of relationship between an item and a merchant. And like, I think that this is the start of the core. The thing is that this is the start of us introducing you to databases, and this is how like certain databases work, is that we have this kind of link via numbers. So the value for merchant ID and item is going to be a direct link to an associated merchant. Right. And so we think about this, I'm like, well, that means that at some point, this item should know about a merchant object, right? And be able to figure like, hey, I've got this ID number. I need to figure out who my merchant is. Right? That's not unreasonable to think about. But this is where things get kind of messy. Is that how do we do that? I'm like, well, one potential approach is like, what if an item like knew about like it's like who in charge here? What object in here would be in charge of all the merchants? Molly?
The merchant repo?
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, merchant repo is in charge of all the merchants. So shouldn't, why not like instantiate a merchant repo in item? And the merchant, I mean, each item that can go like, I'm gonna go look through all the things. We're gonna instantiate a merchant repo, load up all the stuff. And like, that's cool, right? Does that sound like a great idea? Why not?
Because like one item probably shouldn't know about all the merchants.
Yep. And on top of that, like, that's just one item. That's all items. So all items are now instantiating a copy of merchant repository, which then instantiates however many merchants. That feels like a lot. Also, the other way around, each merchant now has a copy of like all the things, all the items, and then the items also have copies of all the merchants, and then now we're like got the spider web of things flying everywhere, and you're just like, doesn't feel good, right? And I think that it could certainly get us into this kind of circular kind of path where we're just like chasing our own tail, going in circles. Also, we kind of want to instantiate things as instantiating as few things as possible. We have this concept of encapsulation where things should only know about the things it needs to know about, and so forth. And so, like, we need to think, well, there's got to be this way in which we can make that jump, right? And it kind of takes a step back a bit. We're saying that like maybe an item should know from a big picture. Let's say that an item should know who its merchant is, and a merchant should have access to know like which items belong to that merchant. Which, like, you know, if I'm setting a store up in Etsy, I should very well damn know what I'm selling, right? These are not like kind of unreasonable asks, but we can't cross this big divide. And the big picture of this class is that we want to traverse the verticals. We want to get from one side to the other. And so when we think about it, like, if my item needs to talk to merchant, where can it go? Let's pick a person at random who's looking at the camera. Susie? This is my stand-in for eye contact who's looking at the camera.
Say up.
Up, right? Up. But like, okay, so that's exactly it. So an item's like, well, I don't know. I know squat about merchants, right? But who do I know? Who can I talk to? Like, well, I guess my item repo. And so we continue this kind of thing. Like, hey, item repo, do you know anything about merchants? Does an item repo know anything about merchants? A merchant repo? No, right? And so we're gonna be like, okay, item repos, and like, well, I don't know anything about merchants. I'm gonna go ask my sales engine. And then the sales engine is like, I don't know anything about merchants, but I know someone that knows, right? Like, you always have that one person, like, oh, I know a person to handle this. And so the merchant repo is gonna, sales engine is like, hey, merchant repo, give me this, I have this ID number, go fetch me this merchant. And that's and it kind of passes that stuff over. And that's this part here is pretty simple. It's like, cool, you know, I just asked my buddy. I know my buddy. But do we? Does an item repo have access to all of its items? Yes, no, maybe. Nods. Yeah, we get some nods in there. Yeah. Doesn't the item know about its repo? Can an item? No, it doesn't. That's a slight wrinkle in that when we form these kind of, I don't want to use like parent-child kind of relationships, because it's kind of like, I think that we can kind of conflate that with like inheritance. But like, let's come up with another term, like downstream relationships are easy. Let's call it downstream, right? An item creates the item objects. And so therefore, because I have all these stored, I can just go ask like, hey, this item, give me your information. It doesn't work upwards. But what we do is that we have techniques for doing that. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to do that. And then first, we're going to talk about how to do that. Second, we're going to talk about where we can start putting code and how we can start building helper methods in order to kind of help us like organize and make our lives easier in the future. So, and this is going to be a little unorganized as I'm just dumping all the files into one place. But this is something you can translate. Cool. And we're gonna doing some pseudocode, but I just want to kind of get you the idea. Like the important part is not like particularly how to do this, but kind of like the flow. And I'll talk about specific ideas in the future. So let's say we have our sales engine, and we're just doing item repo equals item repository dot new, and we're gonna pass it in the path. Oh, like that. Not exactly the same format, but you get the idea. So essentially, we initialize a sales engine, and in the course of this initialization, we are instantiating 2 repos, and we're going to pass the path. Right, and again, we are just going to look at 2 verticals. We're not going to get in more detail because like this is all we need to do the thing. And let's start at. Let's start item repo. That is not how you spell it. Cool. It's going to take a path and then end, and one might do something like create items, and you have a method called def create items, and this could be something where you do load CSV path. We're just going to say like that is what's going to be like loading the CSV stuff, and then what we're going to do is data dot map data map to row. Hey, calm down. Item dot new row and we're just going to say like, hey, this create items method is going to load the stuff from the path that I've given in. I should probably say a path. That makes more sense. And then item RB is class item. Nope. And this here is just going to be the setting of that hash or hash-like object as whatever instance variables you need to store things in. And then you'd have the adder readers, et cetera, et cetera. Any questions so far about what I've done? Let me split this to the right. And I'm not saying this is the way you have to do things. It's just a way of doing it. So do not take what I'm doing here as the word from upon high. Any objections? Anything that we don't like? Let's change. Let's. I think that's an important question. Anything we don't like? Anything that makes us feel uncomfortable? I mean, if you don't say anything, I'm just going to assume you're all cool with it. Zach?
So for this particular example, and I know you just said don't take this as
Yep.
like God's word, but why would you, if the item repository all it cares about is items, why would you load the CSV in items?
Because it's not really the responsibility of the sales engine to do that.
I thought it was like it's the engine that gets the whole mechanism started. So you load in your data and those objects start to propagate everywhere.
I'm sorry, the siren is like, I can't tell, like, do you live near City Park? Because I hear the same siren.
Yes, I do.
So evidently we're neighbors.
The York?
Yes. Do you
We
live in
are
my building?
neighbors. Yeah, I'm 257.
All right. I'm in 333. So this is just like real weird now. Wow.
Favorite Zoom moment ever captured.
Yeah. Because I'm hearing
Agreed.
I'm hearing it out my window. I'm hearing things. I'm like really just my mind's just wigging out. So the engine, I would describe the engine as being the responsibility of the engine is like it's kind of like this traffic cop that shoots information, is like kind of like it handles the flow of information. And so like this here is just kind of like the stand-in. How I would probably have this is I would probably have a separate class, like a file IO class, whose responsibility it is to grab us rows, that block of that array of CSV objects. And the thing is that CSV rows, I describe them as being hash-like because they operate very much like hashes. And I think that that's something you'll find a lot in Ruby, in that a lot of these, we have a lot of objects that work very similar to hashes because hashes are something we're just going to use everywhere, or hash-like objects. So I would probably say that like I would do something like if I was doing this for realsies, I would say data equals file io dot load CSV. And so I'm like, hey, this thing is responsible for getting me rows. I bring that back. And now I'm taking that, I'm going to put that into, I'm going to map over it, create my items, and push that back.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Cool. All right. So, lost my train of thought. Where was I? Okay. So now we have this data. We save that here. And so here's the question, right? An item should know about its merchant. And so presumably we have something that looks like merchant ID equals data. Oops. Oh. Merchant ID. Something very similar to this, right? And so now I'm like, well, I want a thing. I want to go talk to, I want to get a merchant object. And so it's like, cool. And I think that this is a good thing to do. And this is, I've talked to one group about this idea of pushing logic down the stack. We have this diagram. We had this diagram. And like, this is kind of like, I want to envision a stack. And when I say push logic down the stack is that we want to make as many behaviors and methods in these lower level objects as possible in order to kind of make our life a little easier. Finding the item, finding the merchant that an item belongs to, or the merchant associated with item, is going to be something you're going to do over and over again. So why not bake that behavior into the item? So like we can do this a little bit of dream-driven development by saying, hey, why not make a merchant object? I'm sorry, a merchant method in an item that will report to me, that will give me back a merchant object. Now I can use this anytime I need to use this, and it is not like it's not like a thing, right? I don't have to do this over again. And so the problem is that like, hey, for somehow I need to tell my item repository, I'm like, hey, item repo, I need to know about merchants. But as we can see, like, what reference do I have to my item repository? I have no access to it, right? And I'm not going to do a thing where I do item repository equals item repository new, right? Like that's not, we're not going to do that because we discussed like, hey, like when we do this, we start building this like the circular kind of relationship, and it just gets real kind of messy. And I don't even know if that would fail out or not. It's one of those things like, let's not find out if that breaks. It's a bad idea to start with. And so how can we get an item to know about its item repository? And the answer to that is that we can pass a reference to the item about the item repository upon creation. And what that looks like is that here, when we do item.new, we can pass in, we can pass in self. Self is a special keyword in Ruby that refers to the current object that we're in. So when I'm using self here, what I'm saying, I'm like, hey, when I'm creating a new item, I want to give you this reference to myself, to this item repository object. And so now, because we're passing a second argument here, we have to take a second argument here, self here. And now we need to save that. I'm sorry, not self. Words don't mean anything after a while. I'm going to call it parent, or actually we can call it repo. And now, in every single item, we have stored a reference to its parent, to its repository, the item repository. And so what I do here in merchant is like, hey, I have a merchant ID, but I don't know anything about merchants. Who do I know? At this point, who do I know? I know my item repository. So I'm going to ask my item repo, and this has been a little bit of dream-driven development in that, like, I'm just going to write things the way I wish they would work. And I would say, find merchant by ID, and I would pass in merchant ID. Questions to hear? Brant.
More about process
Sure.
than content. So I think my mind typically loves to do dream driven.
Yep.
How do you mesh that with test driven? Do you dream first, then delete and make tests, or how do you
That's a
typically go about
great
that?
question. Yeah. So I'm like, what you're describing is what the term for it is a spike. There is no harder thing to do. Well, there's plenty of hard stuff to do, but it's very difficult in programming to test drive something if you don't know how to do it. Right. So what I'll do is that I'll just do something that'll work. I'm like, cool, I'll solve the problem. I now know how to solve a problem. I'll delete it and then start over using tests. Because without that, you are trying to solve two problems simultaneously: how to do the thing, how to test the thing. What we've done is you've broken that up into two by just doing a spike. And for me, I'd probably like just move on to a separate branch to like just like a throwaway branch, like just mess things up. So like a branch, I'm safe, like I can mess anything up here. There's no risk. I figured out, I'm like, cool, I have solved the problem. I now jump back to my original branch. I've already solved the problem. Now I'm solving the problem like, well, how do I test this? And now having solved the problem, you can now write tests. And then honestly, at the same time, because this is your second time solving the problem you're writing for a second time, this is also like sometimes, like actually all the time, my code this time around is going to be better regardless. It's going to be like a little bit of refactoring built in because this is the second time I'm attacking. So yeah, that's a really good process point.
Thank you.
Regina.
I might answer this question as I ask it,
Sure.
but okay. So item.new row, it brings in, well, you're opening up the items and okay. And then self is making it aware of
The repo.
the repo. Okay. Then you have to go to item, and because now it takes two arguments and you pass in the repo. My question is in item repository, item.new,
Uh-huh.
you're specifically looking at the, are you, no, you're not specifically looking at the items. You're looking at all the data.
Yeah, I have all the data, all the rows,
Oh.
CSV rows, and I'm just making I'm just going through every single row and making a new item object for each.
It's not specifically, oh, but okay, I guess my question is, you're specifically looking at data dot the item file.
Yeah, so data/data here is going to be that mess of CSV rows that we use like this is just loading in.
I guess because you're specifically opening up the item one, because there's different files, there's item, there's
Yeah.
merchant. Why are you able to see the merchant ID later?
Because
From-
merchant ID is part of the item data.
Okay,
Is specifically a
Okay.
column in there.
so we're not even looking at anything in specifically the merchant file. We're
No,
looking
we
at
haven't
the
gotten there
ID
yet. Mhm.
of merchant. Okay, so I'm
Yep.
getting ahead of myself. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Cool. Jameson.
So on line 10 of the item class, is find merchant by ID, is that an instance method from
Yes.
item repository?
Yep, we haven't written it yet because we haven't gotten there yet.
Cool.
Cool. Jermaine?
Yeah, so I was trying to find maybe an analogy to kind of understand that self in the item.new and then
Yeah.
repository. Is
Yeah.
it kind of like an anchor for item in a way to be able to have access to the repo? Like, because I'm assuming you would then, I don't want to jump ahead, but like, would you self inside the sales engine to then get to the repository and then have so that item? Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that like let's put a pin in that, and then as you see you see it from a big picture, I think that we'll see a little better. Molly?
Yeah, I have a question maybe about like the interactions and like which instance variables you would do this for. And I guess my question is like in the database, you would create these connections for keys, right? Like you would create a connection for anything that's going to be interacting with another like table, another set of data. Is that correct? Or is there a reason you would make it for something that's like a non-key instance variable? So like
I would say, yeah, I would say like I would only make this as I needed to. I would not automatically go and do this.
Okay.
Right. Because it's like work for no reason.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if it can be an analogy, or if it can be analogous to the way that you would like tag, like that you would consider like key relations between tables in a database.
Yeah. So to kind of step back and give you kind of bigger picture of what's happening is that sales engine, what we're building here is what's called an object relational model. And we're making you do this because we are cruel. No, because you're going to be working with active record in module 2, which is essentially this kind of thing. And we want you to start building this stuff on your own so you can understand, like when you start working with active record, like this is how this works. Active record will automate a lot of this key linking for us. And we just kind of want to show you, like we want you to see what's happening under the hood.
Okay.
But like in active record, you would specifically have to make these connections, not through like there are helpers that'll make it easier for you, but you are still doing these things and you're still doing so explicitly.
Cool. Okay.
All right. So we are here at the find repo, find my merchant ID. I'm like, cool. So I'm like, well, if I run this, if I run some code, it's going to be like, hey, repo doesn't have a find merchant by ID, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a method def find merchant by ID. It's going to take an ID. And now we get the same problem, don't we? It's like, well, who is item repo going to talk to? Like, well, it's going to talk to our friend sales engine. And we're going to do the same thing here, is that we are going to self. And down here, call engine. So it's like very clear that the difference between two. And over here, we're going to do at engine equals engine. And so now we're going to have a thing. So it's like, hey, item repository doesn't know anything about merchants. So it's going to be like, hey, engine, buddy, pal. Oh my goodness. Engine dot find merchant by ID. And it's going to take the ID that comes in here. Cool. So now we just jump up the chain again. We are going to go over here. Def find merchant by ID. It's going to take an ID. And so now things simplify out, right? Sales engine is like, I know someone that knows about merchants. And merchant repo, and just let me check the specification. Merchant repo, if you did iteration 0, already has a method, doesn't it? So we can leverage the stuff we already had. We're done. And so now for every single item, we have a method called merchant that will go at and get us a merchant object. And so now we've like simplified that down. We do less and less each time. And one thing I want to note specifically is that the law of Demeter still holds, as in I never want to see this. Even this. What is this? What principle does this break? Doing this. Who remembers? Just say it.
Law of Demeter.
Bingo. We only reach one object over. Natia?
So then in this example, would you have a sales engine that's just chock full of like functions to cross-reference data for its repos?
Without remembering 100% of the project, I will say most of it should be. There might be, it should mostly be like like I said, like the analogy I used before, it's a traffic cop, right? It's like directing information left and right. There could potentially be additional stuff in there that could make sense. Like I always say, like, you know, a lot of stuff depends. Like you may feel that certain methods that don't necessarily do that belong in sales engine. And I think that anytime you do something that I would call unexpected, I'm always 100% willing to let you defend it and explain why. Like I think that for myself as well as Megan and Bob, we're always willing to like listen to like justifications, defenses. Like we're more than happy to talk about it. Like we will never not discuss something, but we'll have a good discussion about it. And like there probably is something you can put in sales engine which are reasonable, which are cool. All right. And so the last thing I want to talk about this particular topic is testing. When we test this stuff, does this mean that for item objects, we need to load up an entire sales engine and all the other repos to test this method? That seems gross. That seems like a waste of time. And no, the idea is no. The idea is that when we go upwards, we can use mocks and stubs to stub out a thing. We do not need to test that the item repository finds the appropriate thing. We need to make sure that this, let me get rid of this before. We need to make sure that this reaches upwards, that it does hit the item repository object. We need to make sure that this here does reach upward and hit the sales engine. Sales engine, so what I want to say is that when we go upwards, we use mocks and stubs. When we go downwards, we need to test the full chain. like for sales engine, we need to instantiate a sales engine that instantiates all the repos and can find merchant by ID, can find item by ID. Going downwards, we need to test the full chain. Going upwards, we need just to test the link. Like this will help you when you test, because that means that when you're testing low-level objects, you do not have to instantiate and kind of load everything. This is what's going to make the difference between your test suite taking a couple minutes to run as opposed to 15. If you are testing, shall we say, in a less than optimal fashion, your test suite may take upwards of 10 minutes to run, and that is wasting your time. Joe?
So if I'm understanding correctly, if we're going upwards, we can do mocks and stubs. If we're going down, should we use something like truncated data?
You can. Truncated data is also known as fixtures, Fixtures. That is potentially something you can use. Be very careful. Also, fixture data should go in a fixtures folder in your spec folder. That's where that goes.
Okay.
And this is how we traverse verticals. I want to open up to questions in general. I don't have my water bottle with me. Natia?
I have a question about class methods.
Sure.
Why would you use that instead of a module? For things like when you said do math.
Because modules can be used for a bunch of different things, namespacing, mix-ins. There's a third one who I can't remember the name of. Preference, expandability. If you need to add state to a class, you can. You can't do that with a module. A module is forever going to be stateless.
So in the example of Black Thursday, where you said like there's a lot of math,
Yep.
and that could happen in a class method for math. Since math is just math, I guess I don't understand why.
Yeah, I think that I view classes and using class methods as more of an organizational tool, and modules are more of a tool to like share code, like to reduce repetition. Also, modules have like the 3 separate uses, like in namespacing and using this to make sense. The questions. I have a new water bottle arriving today. When you see it, you'll know. I would describe it as ridiculous. Some would also describe it as excessive, but that is how I live. All right, that's it. You're all set. You have work time for the rest of the morning. Good afternoon. You have your PD stuff at 1 and project work time in the afternoon. We will be around if you have questions. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.